Well, this last week, we ended a fairly long journey, a walk through the Easter story. Today, we start a fairly short journey, a short walk of 5 Sundays through the post-resurrection appearances. Jesus after Easter Sunday and before he ascended into heaven. It's called After the Show. And we're not going to talk about all of the appearances that Jesus made, because there are more than 5. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at an overview of what happened between Easter morning and the ascension, when Jesus goes back to heaven. And each week we're going to tie a song to the message. In fact, it's going to be the title of the message each week, and it's going to be a song that relates to the story. But I want to start out with a bit of scripture from the book of James, chapter 4. Hear these words. Let your patience show itself perfectly in what you do. Then you will be perfect and complete. And I'll have everything, and you'll have everything you need. But if any of you needs wisdom, you should ask God for it. He is generous to everyone and will give you wisdom without criticizing you. But when you ask God, you must believe and not doubt. Anyone who doubts is like a wave in the sea blown up and down by the wind. Such doubters are thinking 2 different things at the same time, and they can't decide about anything they do. They shouldn't think that they will receive anything from the Lord. I have an old college buddy. We were really good friends in college, who went on to have a nationally syndicated bread baking show on PBS. The show was called Breaking Bread with Father Dominic, if you ever happened to see that show. It was on in 70 PBS markets around the country, which, if you don't know TV, that's a lot of markets for PBS. He has written several books. He speaks at events all around the country. In fact, if you Google Father Dominic, you'll find all sorts of information out about him. But one time I was talking to somebody, and he, of all things, he came up in conversation, and I said, oh, he's an old friend of mine. And they said, Father Dominic? Really? I watch him all the time. And then there was a pause, and they said, you don't really know him. I was a little surprised, and I said to him, now think about that. If I was going to make up a story about knowing somebody famous, wouldn't I pick like George Clooney or Sean Connery or Harrison Ford? No offense to Father Dominic, he's my favorite celebrity, but I don't think that's the one you'd make up. But it makes me think that we are skeptical by nature. In this veritable age of reason that we wallow deeper and deeper in, that whole understanding makes us accept fewer and fewer things as, if you'll pardon the pun, gospel, doesn't it? And it's nothing new. It's not a new thing. Gary Cooper, famous actor Gary Cooper, once said, this was after he had turned down the role of Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. He said, I'm just glad Clark Gable is going to be the one falling on his face and not Gary Cooper. Decca Records said in their rejection letter to the Beatles in 1962, we don't like your sound and guitar music is on the way out. I'm guessing the guy who made that decision went on to wear a paper hat and ask people if they wanted fries with that, I'm thinking. Dr. Lee Forrester, who's known as the father of radio and the grandfather of television, once said, man will never reach the moon, regardless of all future scientific advances. And of course, the moon landing conspiracy theorists think he's absolutely correct. Robert Millikan, Nobel Prize in Physics in 1923, he said there is no likelihood that man will ever tap the power of the atom. And Admiral William Leahy, who worked on the U.S. atomic bomb project, he worked on the project, and he said, the bomb will never go off. I speak as an expert in explosives. The head of IBM, refusing to back an idea brought to him that grew into the Xerox Corporation, said, I don't know what use anybody could find for a machine that makes copies of documents, but it certainly couldn't be a feasible business. A professor of electrical engineering at New York University said, the supercomputer is technologically impossible, he said. An editor of business books at Prentice Hall in 1957 said, I have traveled the length and the breadth of this country, and I've talked with the best people, and I assure you that data processing is a fad that won't last the year. Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM in 1943, said, I think in the world, there may be a market for 5 computers. Ken Olsen, founder and president, CEO of Digital Equipment Corporation in 1977 said, there's no reason anybody would want a computer in their home. And Bill Gates, although he later wanted revisionist history and claimed he didn't say this, in 1981 said, 640K of RAM ought to be enough for anybody. But maybe the greatest skeptical comment made in history, in my mind, was made by Charles H. Dewey. He was the commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office in 1899. Okay, 1899, commissioner of the Patent Office, and he said in 1899, everything that can be invented has been. Everything in 1899 had been invented. We're skeptical. That's just who we are, and it was true of the disciples too. I want you to hear that in this story we're going to look at from the Gospel of John in the 20th chapter. Thomas, who was called Didymus, who was one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. Well, the other followers kept telling Thomas, we have seen the Lord. But Thomas said, I won't believe until I see the nail marks in his hands, until I put my finger where the nails were and I put my hand in his side. Well, a week later, the followers were in the house again, and this time Thomas was with them. And the doors were locked, but Jesus came in and stood right in the middle of them. And he said to them, peace be with you. And then he turned to Thomas and he said, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand here in my side. Stop being an unbeliever and believe. And Thomas looked at Jesus and he said, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus said to him, you believe because you have seen me. But those who believe without seeing me will be truly blessed. There was a defendant and he was on trial for murder. And the evidence was strong against him, frankly. But there was no body. So the greatest piece of evidence they would have had, they didn't have. There was no body. And so in closing statements, his attorney tried to find reasonable doubt. And his attorney said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have a surprise for you this afternoon. In exactly 1 minute, the person who is presumed to be dead is going to walk into this courtroom. And he turned and he looked at the door of the courtroom. Well, of course, all the jurors turned and looked at the courtroom, and everybody sat and waited and looked at the door for a minute. Minute passed, minute and a half passed, and you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. And finally, the attorney said, I made all of that up. But you all looked, and therefore there must be reasonable doubt. Therefore, you have to find my client not guilty. Well, the jury went off to deliberate, but they were only gone a few minutes. And they came back, and when they came back with a guilty verdict. And the attorney for the defendant said, How could you have possibly done that? You must have had some doubt. You looked. And the jury foreman said to him, we looked, but your client didn't. We were born and raised to be skeptical. And I was born and raised on the Illinois side of St. Louis. So I'm an honorary Missourian. I have a show-me attitude. And really, don't we all have that? Don't we all have honorary citizenship in Missouri? We want proof. And we want lots of it before we're willing to commit ourselves to really anything. And I don't know, really, maybe that's not a bad thing. Grand claims should be backed up with hard facts. Because we no longer settle for the magical realm of alchemy found in Lord of the Rings. Instead, we are much more comfortable with just the facts, ma'am, as found in Dragnet. But here, Thomas is not confronted with just the facts. Did you notice that? There is no Jesus walking through the door, the first part of this scene. Instead, Thomas has nothing to go on but somebody else's word. Hearsay is what he has to go on. But it's important to understand in this story, because I think Thomas gets a bad rap in this story. He isn't singled out as an example of doubt because of a weak commitment or because of a watered-down faith. Quite the opposite, in fact. Thomas's commitment to Jesus, especially as found in the Gospel of John, is enthusiastic, it's wholehearted, and it's fueled by witnessing miracles performed and lives transformed. He was very attentive to Jesus' deeds, But he wasn't nearly as attentive to Jesus' words. His faith was based on a seeing is believing approach. And that had served him well up to the point of the story. So why change your tune now? Why change your spots? If it's always worked for you, stick with it. So Thomas falls back on the old reliable source of strength. A hands-on physicality of Jesus' earthly ministry. If I see it, I'll believe it. But what Thomas was missing was that from the moment of death on the cross to this moment, Jesus' ministry had taken a quantum leap forward. While Thomas was out of the room, all the rules changed, and nobody told him. So I wonder this morning, what keeps you out of the room? What prevents you from allowing the resurrection to move you forward? Well, I think if we're honest, for most of us, it's fear. Because the truth of the matter is, when the ground rules change, what has been our greatest strengths often turn into our greatest liabilities. And right now you're processing that and you're thinking, well, that's ridiculous. How can my greatest strength be my greatest liability, my greatest weakness? Well, here's an example from the Borden Food Company. Back in the day, there were few companies more familiar or respected or successful than Borden Foods. If you're trying to picture Borden Foods, think Elsie the cow, Borden Foods. But what put Elsie in almost every fridge in America is also what eventually led to her downfall. Borden's strengths became their weakness. Because other companies started growing up around them, and they started taking larger and larger shares of the snack market and the ice cream market and the convenience food market. And yet Borden saw no reason to change, no reason to add, no reason to alter what they were doing. And their unwillingness to change is what eventually brought Elsie to her knees. Because after a significant amount of financial loss in the early 90s, an equity firm called KKR came in and did a leveraged takeover of Borden Foods in 1995. And in just 6 years, by 2001, they had shut down Borden's food products operations, and by 2005, they had divested all of Borden's operations. Borden had ceased to exist. In the end, poor Elsie was led to the slaughterhouse at a price much lower than anybody imagined possible, all because of an unwillingness to change. Psalm 31 talks about that. It talks about change and doubt and commitment. Hear these words. It says, "Praise the Lord. His love to me was wonderful when my city was attacked. In my distress, I said, God can't see me. But you heard my prayer when I cried out to you for help. Love the Lord, all of you who belong to him. The Lord protects those who truly believe, but punishes the proud as much as they have sinned. All you who put your hope in the Lord, be strong and brave." Now, I want you to understand that a healthy dose of doubt is not a bad thing. I'm convinced that if we couldn't sincerely doubt, then we wouldn't completely believe. If we're not willing to doubt and ask questions, we can't ever get to a point of complete surrender to God. But good old doubting Thomas here shows us how to escape the snare of being conned by our own strengths. Because after hiding his strengths, which was his commitment to Jesus' earthly ministry of visible signs and wonders, Thomas had the humility to accept Jesus' offer of forgiveness and love when he appeared before Thomas, alive and in the flesh. Thomas had a radical shift in that moment when Jesus appeared before him and said, "You need proof? Here I am. Put your fingers right here where the nail holes were." When he was confronted by a risen Christ, Thomas didn't have to do that. He didn't even have to touch the resurrected, glorified body like he said he was going to need. Instead, all he could do was stand in amazement and wonder and say, "My Lord and my God." And did you realize that that is the only explicit confession of the divinity of Jesus in the whole of the Gospel of John? That's the only place in the Gospel of John where it's a very explicit confession of Jesus as Lord. And it comes from our good old buddy, Doubting Thomas. Our doubting friend is the only one who completely and unabashedly claims Jesus as the God in the flesh. Thomas responds to Jesus' offer of love and forgiveness in this story. And he does it by allowing himself to be weak enough to accept the fact that his strength had become his potential for self-destruction. Thomas lets go of his show me attitude, and he accepts the gift of faith and forgiveness that Jesus offers him. You notice today is called the Long and Winding Road. If you're even a mild Beatles fan, you will recognize that tune. Paul McCartney wrote that tune. I assumed it was a McCartney and Lennon song, but it's Paul McCartney wrote it. In fact, he wrote it on his farm in Scotland. He said, I found my best work, my best ability to write was done on that farm. It was for the album Let It Be, and it was their 20th and what would prove to be their last #1 song. In fact, it would prove to be their last single ever released by the group, The Long and Winding Road. He wrote it about the dissension and the growing tension between the various members of the band. But I think it also has a lot to say this morning about life and about faith and about doubt. Here's some of these words from the song. The long, and imagine that we're saying this to God as you hear these words. The long and winding road that leads to your door will never disappear. I've seen that road before. It always leads me here. Lead me to your door. Many times I've been alone. Many times I've cried. Anyway, you'll never know how many times I've tried. But still they lead me back to the long and the winding road. Not about you, but I find that life leads us all over the place, winding in and out of all sorts of things, many of which we shouldn't be a part of. And because of that, life often finds us alone and brokenhearted. But we learn today from Thomas's doubt and Thomas's brokenheartedness that it's Jesus who continues to urge us forward, seeking greater understanding and deeper faith for ourselves and those around us. That unending road of life always leads us back to God if we're willing to stick with it. I recently came across this statement. Here it is. Conversion without immersion is perversion. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. Let's walk through that real quickly. Conversion. In other words, becoming a sold-out follower of Jesus Christ. Okay? Conversion without immersion. I don't know about you, but the first thing I think of when I hear that word is dunking for baptism. But that's not what it means here. It's not a dunking baptism sort of thing. But instead it means without plunging headfirst into the life of a Christian. Okay, so conversion without immersion is perversion. That is vulgar and degenerative. If we claim to be Christians, but we don't truly immerse ourselves in the commitment that follows that, then we're simply playing church, and we're not actively living out our faith. A writer by the name of Herb Kahn maybe said it rather bluntly, but he said it this way. This is the way he describes it. The trouble with born-again Christians is that they're often an even bigger pain the second time around. So I wonder this morning, what's your greatest strength? What's your greatest strength? It's probably also where you're the most vulnerable. Has your greatest strength become your greatest weakness? Jesus' gift to Thomas that day empowered him to stop doubting and to instead believe. And that same gift can empower us the exact same way. You see, because instead of show me signs, what God ultimately offers us is an unmerited gift of grace. One that we can't earn and one that we don't deserve. And that gift is the love and the forgiveness and the grace of Jesus Christ. As the musicians come forward, I'm going to invite you if you would pray with me.